Hey there, I'm Alan Firstenberg.
And I'm Mark Tucker. Welcome to Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs. Hey, Mark. How's
Hey,
your week?
we're back in it.
Like, we're back in our old recording software. Yes. Yeah. Hopefully, we'll get a grip on the new recording software at some point, but that will not be tonight.
Yes.
Tonight we'll be talking about stuff instead of kind of talking.
Yeah,
Anyway, no.
trying to fiddle with settings and
Yeah.
all that stuff.
Anyway, so let's talk about stuff. And you know what? Let's talk about talking. Because we're voice devs, so that kind of makes sense.
Yeah,
And we've talked about technologies like SSML in the past.
right.
Um, but one thing that kind of comes up every time I talk about this with people, and we've got in particular, one of our listeners and a good friend for the past several years, Andy, has kind of said, hi Andy, yeah. One of the things that would really be good is if we could really just get away for web pages to talk.
Mm-hmm.
And Andy works in accessibility. That's what she does professionally. So I think it's helped me learn a lot about how accessibility systems use web pages and use mobile devices and do screen readers and so forth. But she's always kind of said, wouldn't it be great if there was just a better way of doing that? And a couple of weeks back, a couple of years back, I guess is where the story starts.
Yeah.
While on one of my office hours and talking about this, she kind of said, wouldn't it be great if, CSS could do audio? So we did a search and we discovered, lo and behold, there was a group that had been working on this for 15 or so years.
Yeah, just
So
long time. Yeah.
long time, had some stops and starts, but it was being worked on. And at that time the last update was in 2020 or so. And then 2 weeks ago she suddenly sent me a message saying, hey, did you notice that the CSS thing for speech has been updated and it's now, a candidate recommendation draft? And I said, no. So we pulled it up and discussed it together. And lo and behold, there is now a CSS Speech Module Level 1 candidate recommendation draft that has been in place for a year.
And it came out in 2023, February 14th. So sending lots of love to this candidate recommendation for CSS Speech. And it's kind of interesting. So I think we'll probably spend some time talking about CSS Speech, but we want to maybe along the way or circle back to the end, talk a little bit about speech synthesis markup language, SSML, and also briefly mention speech markdown. So those are kind of some of the things. And also, I've had some recent experience on a project I'm working on that has to do with screen readers. So that I think it kind of all fits together.
I think it does.
So one of the first things I noticed about this, because I was just trying to figure out like what's the scope of this, why was this created? It says that the standard was developed in cooperation with the voice browser activity. And so I go over to the tab for voice browser activity, and that working group was officially closed in 2015.
Right.
So I'm a little confused. They've got some innovation going on for a group, a voice browser group that's no longer active. But this idea of using speech, and this is going to be output. This is text to speech. That how do we get browsers to talk? That's kind of that voice interaction, voice browser stuff has been around for a long time. Like even SSML, the most recent version of that is 1.1, and that was in 2010.
Yeah.
So a lot of work over a lot of years. Some of them is, kind of got adapted, like the whole series with Alexa and stuff with SSML Google Assistant, a number, Bixby used SSML for their output, but this is just kind of a new take, and there are some similarities, it's kind of some parallels about some of the functionality that was in SSML and what's in CSS Speech.
Yeah,
But
I think one of the neat things was that they acknowledge this right up front. There's a
Yep.
section early on that says, what's the relationship between this and SSML? And they kind of say, there isn't one really. There are some parallels and some things
Yeah.
that are different between the two, but also that they kind of serve slightly different goals. And I think it's important to understand that they are slightly different goals.
Yeah.
I think it would be interesting, though, to see if someone created a HTML with CSS speech to SSML converter. I think that would be interesting. On the
Yeah.
other hand, we're also seeing this slow shift away from SSML as we move into newer speech processing systems.
Yeah, so let's talk about it. So we're talking about web pages, we're talking about HTML, and so this is the same old CSS that's going to be attached to HTML, but CSS is more decorating kind of the structure around the text, whereas SSML is kind of embedded in with the text, is kind of
Yes.
how I thought about it. So definitely different styles. And SSML is very much XML based. HTML is XML, kind of XML based. And CSS is different. It's decorating portions of your document with tags and syntax that would then voicify the content that is in those tags.
I think the difference is that HTML tries to be semantic. It tries to describe, broadly speaking, what this text, how this text should be understood,
Right.
perceived. Whereas a visual style sheet, CSS, for a visual, then says, well, okay, given that, what does it semantically look like? So if you've got something that, HTML is saying, this is a very important header, this is a header, this is a plain old paragraph, this is a paragraph that is quoting something else. CSS then says, well, okay, our, headline should be in 30-point font with using serifed font. Maybe even using this custom serifed font. And smaller ones should be smaller fonts, and we're going to represent paragraphs using this font with this font size. But when we're doing quotations, we may make that slightly lighter and we want to kind of indent it a little. What the speech module is then saying is, okay, how do we take these notions and let you hear them? So
Right.
what does a headline sound like?
Yes, and it's this is a hard word. I don't know if the distinction. It's aural, as in AURAL, which meaning the ears, as opposed to oral, which is speaking. But yeah, it's like, I like how you said it. It's like how does this title sound? How does this paragraph sound? How does this quoted paragraph sound different? And so you've got the core of your HTML document, which is divided up into sections and headers and bodies and divs and all that stuff. But it can be structured differently based on the type of browser, whether it's a browser on a desktop versus a browser on a phone, screen size. It can be different based on country, locale. It can be different based on lots of different things, even like minimal structure. And then kind of the way that this is typically approached today for those that are visually impaired would be to some sort of a screen reader that is reading that same core structure and kind of ignoring the visual aspects of it and just pulling out the audio aspects of it. But then that also means, you've got to do different things. In some cases, you might need to decorate things with ARIA tags and other things to kind of try to explain to the screen reader what this, some additional things that you can't just derive from the content. And I think this idea of using CSS speech is trying to say, well, what's a different way of doing that? What's a way of doing like an auditory viewport into, I guess, sound port, whatever, just a audio representation of that page. And maybe in some cases it might be kind of a more streamlined approach, or different programming approach.
Well, I think we need to be careful though, because the specification itself kind of makes it clear that while accessibility issues are part of this, this isn't an accessibility solution.
Okay.
So ARIA tags are still important there because they're there to describe what certain things are used for and how they're used and how screen readers should handle them and so forth. That this, for example, is a form field, that this is, a button that you click on to do something. Whereas audibly, we might want to, this is now saying that I, as a web page developer, might want to make sure that before every time I'm quoting something, that visually might be rendered as an inline quote, or sorry, as an indented quote. Maybe because of my website, I want that, I want to make it sound like somebody is clearing their throat before all of these paragraphs. Or, so before, and it's spoken in a different voice by somebody else.
Yeah. Official orator's voice, right? As opposed to, yeah.
Exactly. So this, whereas ARIA is there to help screen readers identify what something is and how it's used and so forth, this is really trying to say, when I want this presented, here's the tone that I want it presented in. Another example is that, links in screen readers. When you get, usually the screen reader will, be reading along and suddenly say link and the text behind it, just to say, here's a link. What if I, knowing that that's going to happen, don't really want that, but I do want an indication that something is, that this is a link. Maybe it'll be a link to, on page, maybe a link to something inside my website, maybe a link to an external document. You see a lot of web pages that have a different icon there for external links. Well, now we can have an earcon.
Yep. Some sort of a cue, auditory cue that something's is about to happen, or something just happened.
Could happen, or could happen, that if you followed thing, this is a link, and not just a link, it's a link that will take you off this website. Okay,
so I think that's an important part, because we talked a little bit about screen readers. The main, accessibility is the main reason for screen readers, and it's about interactivity with the web page, whereas the focus of CSS speech is really on how to present the output of the content.
I think that's a great way to put it.
It's not necessarily about interactivity.
Right. One of the things that they talk about is that this is the sort of that CSS speech, in addition to being used for accessibility purposes, is also great for the kind of stuff that we as voice developers have been talking about for a while. How do you use this in an e-reader? How do you use this when you are driving? These are useful things to present.
How could you make this a voice, like a voice game show experience, or different things like that? I see.
So it's really, it's bigger than just saying this now gives you access to something. This is more, how do we make it so that this is a pleasant user experience under a wide variety of situations?
Right. And so I guess the important part is that the browser, since browsers
Let's call it a browser. Sure.
parses HTML and renders something, um, you know. So this is about a voice browser, and that makes sense of why that was like tied to the voice browser activity group.
Right. But again, let's be clear. This is about the output from a voice browser.
Yep.
Nowhere does it talk about input.
Yeah, that is true. So in order for this specification to work, you would need a browser that supports CSS speech.
Correct.
Otherwise, yeah.
And right now, nothing does.
Right. All right.
Although I did find an interesting web page that claimed to be a demo of this that used other technologies that are common in browsers these days, the web speech API, that it was using it to simulate it. But as far as I could tell, it wasn't actually working.
Okay.
Anyway, so that's kind of that's now spending a good chunk of time talking about the why and kind of what this is. Let's talk a little bit about some of the details.
So first thing out of the box to me that was interesting, kind of this correlation from CSS for visual versus CSS for hearing, is this idea of the box model. If you've done HTML, you've got this element, but this element could have padding around it. It can have margins, and so that whole thing, there's like a box model, and you can use that for spacing between things. You could add a border to some or all of the different areas. That also helps you, like, I want so much spacing afterwards, after this heading. So it gives you a lot of control visually. The box model does, and so they came up with this aural, once again, AURAL box model concept, where surrounding each element, there's a pause before that you can do something there. You can control like how long that pause is. There's a cue, which you could play some sort of audio sound. So there's before pause, before cue, before rest. So that's another place to do a pause. I guess between the cue and the actual content. Then it will read the content of the tag, and then afterwards there's an after rest, after cue, after pause. So then you get another chance to add delays or add audio sounds. So that's kind of an interesting thing that I'm like, that's kind of clever.
I thought that was excellent, because it's literally saying, here are these things that you're used to in a visual model.
Yep.
And here's their corresponding bits in an audible model. I thought that was fantastic.
Yeah.
And we see this again in some other things, which we'll talk about later, is they make clear analogies between, here's what you do visually and here's why you want it, and here's how you can do something similar audibly.
Yeah.
No, I agree. When I saw that, that's when I realized that there was really something to this. That
there's just some innovation there. That's some, and that's not to talk a lot about speech markdown at this point in time, but that's kind of some type of thing. As I started investigating SSML and investigating different things, like, well, how would that relate to markdown? What would be, and then you start trying to think through that. And so I can kind of see how they approached this, where they were like really trying to interrogate what makes CSS and what some of the strengths. One of the things also later on is this concept of fonts visually, where you can say, show this font, or if that font's not available, then show this font, and you can kind of have a fallback. They can do the same thing with voices.
With voice. No, I thought that I thought was a great parallel too. So while you have font families and you define this hierarchy of font families, in the same way you have voice families and this hierarchy of voice families. There are differences, to be sure, but I think it's, just the notion that you have this concept and this understanding of the fact that, well, okay, we want to be able to default to this name, But if that name's not available, default to this one. And if that name's not available, then default to a gender neutral voice.
Yep.
So very clever concepts going on here.
Yeah. I would agree. So I think those are kind of the two, I think, most innovative parts of it. And then everything's kind of structured around this this box model of
Yes.
where so and that and CSS. So you can specify these additional CSS tags that have to do with how things are going to sound. And then you relate them the same way. You can relate them to a specific tag or a specific class, or like a tag type like header one, or to a certain class that you name on an element on a span or on a div, or you can inline right into the span or div some of this stuff, and it would relate to the content that's being wrapped by that boundary.
Right. I think the neat thing about style sheets in general is that you can specify them in so many ways and attach them in so many ways. So, you can say, I'm going to define this class of things. And every time I identify a tag in HTML as this class, it will take on all the attributes that I've defined in CSS that match that.
Yeah.
Or bunches of other ways to deal with things. It's ridiculously flexible.
Well, I didn't look into it too deeply, but there was also some references where it seemed like with CSS where you can inherit, and there's overlaying of multiple layers that
Yes.
determine ultimately what's the end result. Seemed like that same concept was being applied with CSS.
Right. I mean, that's the C in CSS, is this cascading notion where you can set attributes in the overall box, and then a narrow one inherits those unless you say otherwise.
Right.
So that's very powerful. That means you can set a voice that you're generally going to use on the entire document. But, for headers, I'm going to use a slightly different one. And maybe in some cases when I'm quoting, I'll use it in a slightly different,
And on this very specific segment of text, I want it to be handled differently.
Right.
So you can get all the way down to a specific, element content, or you can do it, at any level going up and down.
So there were a couple of things about it that I found interesting, and in some ways that I don't think we've really thought of or seen before. One of the ones I find really neat is that there's a property they call voice balance.
Yes, that was innovative as well.
And there's no SSML equivalent of this one. And it's basically saying that the kind of underlying audio assumption is that it's a stereo output. So voice balance specifies where is the voice coming from: left, center, right, leftwards or rightwards, or a number that kind of gives direction of, left to right somewhere.
Yeah, positive 100 is like, I think, right, all the way to 0, which is center, to minus 100 is left.
Right.
So you could conceptually have something playing and progressively have it walk across your ear,
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Or, well, that's actually, I think, tricky to do automatically because we don't have this notion of gradients of anything.
Yeah.
That's a pretty advanced CSS concept visually even.
Yeah.
But certainly you could, have some way to progress it yourself.
Yeah, you could step it. You could say this one's going to be 100, this one's going to be 80, this one's going to be 60, 20, 10, 0, and then go the other way. Then you'll start to hear it just out of one, hear it more but less until they're equal, and then more and less till this is 0. So yeah.
But I think about this in terms of conversation. So if you've got a script or just a book even, you can have the narrator coming out of the center channel, one person speaking coming, the woman speaking coming out of the left channel with a female voice, the man speaking coming out of the right channel in a male voice, and you can specify that in CSS.
That is interesting.
And so all you need to do then in your HTML is just mark up saying who is saying what,
Mhm.
and then visually you don't see any difference. Audibly, you'll hear the difference just automatically. I think
Yep.
that's a neat concept. I think there are neat things you can do with that. And that's known as the voice balance property, which I think is neat.
Yeah.
I think the notion of the cue before, cue after are also neat because they do start introducing this earcon notion that we've
Yeah.
talked about before. So now it means that if you've used graphics for icons, now I also have earcons that can be matched to an icon.
Yes.
And that could be pretty cool. So what were some of the things that you found interesting?
Well, because I've done a lot of work with SSML, then I was kind of curious, like, well, how do they handle the concept of emphasis or slowing down the rate of speech or making it louder or softer? And so those types of things are handled. So things that would be found in the prosody tag in SSML is handled. And the audio tag, we already talked about queuing. You've got those two spots where you can queue and say audio there. You can also do like before everything, after everything, or like on items. So like you could say the following is a list, and
Yeah.
then like item number one, or first item, next item, next item. So you could have it play a sound or
Wow.
audio of somebody speaking
Yeah.
each of the different items. You can even replace saying, if there's an audio file available, then play that, but otherwise then do the text. So you could actually, have a document that's, like words to a play. And then if they have an audio file available, then, or for that specific section, or for browsers that support, it would be like an actual audio file of, some actor, actually saying those lines or something like that. So those are interesting. So kind of your main necessities of volume, rate, pitch, audio, emphasis, breaks. So like pauses. So that's where your rest and your pauses, kind of in that box model, where you can plug those things in. There is some limited functionality for what was say as. Say as is the ability to say, I'm just going to say it like it is, and I'm going to do appropriate pauses for punctuation. So a comma is, a smaller pause than a period would be. Or you could say, I want this to be read out like characters. So if you have an acronym, then it could read like each letter in the acronym. Or if it's a number, you could read out as digits. So like 2112, it could be read out as 2112. But that is a little bit limited. There's a lot more functionality in SSML that does that.
Yes.
And then the kind of the last one that's included is this.
And to be clear, what you just referred to is what they call the speak as property.
So in SSML is say as,
right,
and and then it's speak as in the CSS speech. Exactly. Right. Good. Thanks because there's that naming difference. Then there is the sub alias. So you can say you might have an acronym, or you might have somebody's name or something that is kind of abbreviated or one way, and you can have it be said differently than what it's displayed as. And so that's the SSML equivalent of sub, and with the alias property. But that's also somewhat limited.
I was going to say, how is that done?
Yeah, so what you can do is you can assign some sort of an attribute. In this case, it's like W3C is the text that's going to be visible, but they surrounded that with a ABBR tag with a property of title being World Wide Web Consortium. Now, in the CSS property for ABBR, it's saying take the content from the attribute that is title. So what that means then is that it's going to show W3C on the screen, but when it's spoken out, it's going to say World Wide Web Consortium. So that's how they handle sub alias. But what isn't covered, kind of the big omission here, is phonemes.
Yes.
So the sub, in a lot of cases, I guess there are certain cases where sub would be used, and other cases where phonemes would be used. But if you've got something that's particularly challenging to pronounce and you want to make sure that it's being pronounced correctly, that's where you'd use phoneme. But that's not something that's available in this. I think the concern is that you would have to go through, and as you change as different text happens, you would have to go in and change the tag and the CSS, and they're kind of saying that would be something that would be better handled on the server, figuring out which text to use and sending that down. But that is an omission, and I think that there are definitely some use cases where phoneme would be useful that can't be handled by a simple sub.
Yeah, and I still find it odd that they omitted it. It would not surprise me if it got reintroduced again in the future in some way.
Yeah, because there was some conversation in here about why they weren't there. Like it wasn't a draft. So yeah, phonemes, this is section 15, phonemes property was described in earlier drafts of this specification, but objections were raised due to breaking the principle of separation between content and presentation. And so it was left out.
Right, and I mean, on some sense, I get that. And also, it's tough on generated content to have to, as we know well with SSML. But I feel like if they don't address it in some way at some point, it's going to be an issue.
Yeah.
And I guess I feel like, it is presentation because it is forcing how something is pronounced, which is very much audible.
Very much, yeah.
Yeah. So yes, I think phonemes are a major missing element from this. The other element that I found oddly missing is that it doesn't have the equivalent of background color. So there's no way to have background audio.
Yes. Yeah, that is interesting. Because yeah, I could see where it's like, on this got some, outdoor scene, the birds are singing, you've got,
Right.
A breeze, a river going, and then the story's being read, over top of that or whatever. So yeah, I could see that would be.
It's not a surprising omission. I mean, after all, SSML standard doesn't have it.
Yeah. Mixing
Google
of audio is difficult on the browser,
yep.
or at least, yeah, that's not something that's just slam dunk easy.
Right. So I understand why it's missing, but I still find it interesting that it's missing.
Yeah.
And again, I hope a later version addresses that. I don't know. I don't know if this is going anywhere, to be perfectly honest. It's kind of been languishing for 20 years or so. But I'm hopeful. I think it would be really neat to, it's not a standard yet. Nothing implements it.
Yep.
But I think it would be a really, really interesting and useful addition to browsers. I would, but then, and I would love to see it implemented. But then again, I would point out SSML languished doing nothing for, 8 years or so before Amazon discovered it.
Yeah, and like, oh, this would be perfect for our text-to-speech for Alexa. Yeah.
So maybe this will be discovered at the right time. Let's hope for that one.
Yeah. So once again, this is very much in order for CSS, you need to have HTML, and a browser is the thing that renders HTML. So that's the world that we're living in with that.
Yep. So let's talk, I guess, briefly about SSML and speech markdown.
Yes, so two versions of SSML. 20 so the version 1.0 came out, I think it was 20, what was that? 2004? Yes, 2004. And then SSML 1.1 was 2010. So um, it pretty much covers a lot of the same things. I think we covered all the major things. This kind of correlation that this document did, CSS Speech did with SSML, was based on the 1.1 version, but there wasn't really anything new in 1.1 that was specifically called out in this CSS sheet. But yeah, I'm not sure that there's really a lot. There are some additional tags like the mark tag, which was kind of interesting.
I love the mark tag.
I do love the mark tag because that's something that, and I'm really bummed about Google's web implementation and not being available to developers, because with this mark tag is that you could have something being said, and at certain points in time, this mark tag would in essence fire, and you could control things, visual things on the
Yeah.
the hub
What,
display. But
one of the things I found interesting though about CSS Speech is that they kind of flip that around. There's a property called voice duration, which says that everything inside this element needs to be said within this amount of time.
yes, which it would be interesting, yeah, to all right, you got to sound like a chipmunk, or you've got
Well, I mean, I find it interesting in the sense that if you're coordinating it with other graphical
oh,
events that are happening at the same time.
oh, I can see that. So you can have like an animation that's going to take 3 seconds, and you want to make sure that this, or you can say, this content is going to run. And what's interesting, I haven't read it enough, is like that whole box model. If you have content that lasts 2 seconds and an animation that lasts 3 seconds, I'm wondering if there's a way that you can say basically that this whole the whole thing's going to be set out at a certain time, but honor the pauses and the cues and the rests and the contents being spoken, so that then it lines up with that same 3 seconds.
Yeah, I need to read it more carefully about exactly how it
Yeah.
computes it. And it looked complicated. Some things were applied, some things weren't. It makes sense in certain way, so it was complicated looking. I didn't read through it too carefully, because
Yeah.
fortunately I don't need to implement it. So it was an interesting kind of inverse of this notion of the notion of mark. And yes, I agree with you. I loved mark as well.
Yeah.
So
That's really the only one that I missed. The other ones, I think they're sufficiently covered, except for like I was saying, the Sayas tag.
Sayas, if I remember correctly, was very, very rich and complicated. So it
It
had
was, and it was like specific to the device. So, or like Alexa's implementation versus some other implementation. So you could say like, here's the format of the date. So it's month, day, year, or
right.
day, month. And so then when you could just say, speak this, and this is the format that it's represented in. So then it would speak it correctly. So that's something that's missing. What else? There was a number of, there's a whole, Sayas has a whole list of things like, this is an address, this is a cardinal, characters, date with specific formats, digits. I'm actually looking at the ssml.guru page website that lists all these different elements for SSML, but digits, expletive, fractions, letters, different numbers, spelling out, telephone numbers, timed with different formats. So those, there's it's not as rich. CSS speech is not as rich as far as to
No,
speak
but you
as.
know what? I'll be honest. I'd love to see this implemented, and
Yep.
and hopefully get a second release with some updates, happening relatively quickly after.
Yeah.
Because I think once you get the basics of it in, That's the important bit.
Yeah, and it looked like I was trying to remember. So on the acknowledgements, there are two people, Ellen Edie from IBM and Alika Eternad as acknowledgements, but does it say at the top who oh, here this it does, the editors. So the
Yeah,
actual editors is at the top of the document. I'm sorry. So we've got
right. And one of this is interesting. One of the editors, Claudio Santam Brogio,
yeah,
is from Opera Software. So that's a browser manufacturer.
that is, yeah. Yeah, so we have different companies represented. So two editors, three former editors, a couple of like additional people that gave feedback on it. So so congratulations to them. I appreciate their efforts in progressing this further. It's been we're coming up on a year since this candidate recommendation draft came out. So we're wondering what's going to happen with it.
You know, I feel like that's kind of the funny thing, is that none of us in what we think of as the voice community noticed this for a whole year.
Yeah, and it's and I've put a whole bunch of time into understanding SSML and how that works across different devices in the voice assistant world, and yeah, this totally I didn't even notice
No,
this
so
a bit of change.
I hope that we in the voice industry pay more attention to it. I hope that it goes somewhere, because I think this is really I think it's significant. I think it's important. I think it's more important than what we're currently seeing, the crop of text to speech generators, which aren't even paying attention to SSML, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, they're pretty much just like here's just reading off what the content is, and there's not
Yeah,
a lot of formatting or kind of fine tuning of the speech output.
I think there's a lot more that we can and should be doing with it, and
I agree.
I look forward to it. And I'd like to hear what other folks think. Is there something that you feel is missing? Is there something that you feel it goes too far? Do you really think people are going to implement this? So, leave us a comment in the comment section below. Find us on social media, LinkedIn and elsewhere. Love to hear what you have to say. And I am sure that we can pick this up another time, maybe even with a recording system that works on Two Voice Devs.
Two voice tabs. Take care, Alan.
Take care, Mark. Have a great week.
All right.